All right, we're ready to go. So thank you all for coming. We are going to do a walkthrough of our warrant and budget considerations. And we've done this the last couple of years, so we'll have advisory first and then the school committee. So Brian, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. So the plan for tonight is we're going to walk through the slides that we intend to use for next week's annual town meeting, and we can take questions at the end. This first slide is just a summary of the operating budget, and I know everybody in the room is totally familiar with what that is, but for folks who might be coming to this for the first time, the operating budget is really like the sort of regularly recurring expenses of managing the town. And so that would include things like the school budget, police budget, fire department, and it would exclude special one-time expenses like capital items. So for fiscal year 2019, our total operating budget is going up 1.92% to $23.5 million. So that's again a 1.92% increase over 2018. And just for some perspective, 2018 was a 3.24% increase over 2017. So we're not doing too bad. The next slide shows total budgeted expenditures. So that includes the operating budget, but then we also add in things like our capital expenses, which are reflected in these separate warrant articles that everybody will be voting on at town meeting. The total budgeted expenditures are actually going down 0.24%, and that's mostly because we're going to be spending a little bit less on capital items and debt and borrowing than we have in the past. So that's a modest decrease year over year. This shows sources of revenue for fiscal year 2019. Sort of what we've come to expect is that property taxes are the vast bulk of our revenue. And you can see here, it's when you include property taxes that are within the levy limit and taxes that are debt excluded, we're almost like 88% of revenue is from taxes. Then we've got state aid, which is just a sliver of our total revenue at just over 1%. Local receipts includes things like fees, licenses, fines, permits, those types of things, motor vehicle excise. That's 5.6% of our revenue. And then other available funds, which includes our overlay surplus, our cell tower, our ambulance receipts reserved, coming in at 2.4% of our total revenue. And then at the bottom, you see some free cash and borrowing amounts, which are, for accounting purposes, they're reflected as sources of revenue, but they're really not flows of cash coming into the town from anywhere but like prior year's free cash for the most part. So this next slide gives you sort of a more realistic picture of our real revenues. And you'll see that almost 92% of our revenues come through residential and business taxes, and then just a very small sliver comes from state revenues, and a little bit more in local receipts. The reason why we wanted to include this slide to kind of visually display the fact that as a town, we rely incredibly heavily on residential and business taxes as our sources of revenue. There are other towns and municipalities across the Commonwealth, for example, that get more state aid. So their state revenue slice of the pie would be higher than ours. This provides an overview of total expenditures by sort of budget category. The biggest component of our budget is always the education component, which includes not just the Nashoba assessment, but also the Minuteman assessment, which actually this year increased over $100,000. So that was a fairly big increase. Below education, you've got town department expenses that come in the form of salary and wages. We've also got other operating expenses, and the reason why we separate out other operating expenses from salary and wages is that, in general, advisory and selectmen don't have a ton of discretion over salary and wages. Those are pretty much determined by contract. One example where we might have a bit more discretion is actually in this year's budget, where we've included an amount for a fire chief. So obviously that salary portion is different from prior years, but in general, the salary and wages are things that are determined by contract, and we don't have much discretion over that. Insurance, benefits, and retirement expenses are also another budget lever that we don't have a ton of discretion over, because, you know, in the case of insurance premiums, they are what they are. There's not too much we can do about that, although later in the presentation we'll describe a couple things that the town is trying to do to contain healthcare costs. Below that are our debt service costs, and actually I think one of the things the town should be relatively proud of is that our debt service, the debt service component of our budget has been decreasing for the past several years, and right now, as a total percentage of our budget, it's just around 5.6%, which is right in the sweet spot of what we've been targeting, so we're pretty pleased with that. Other expenditures, actually that's kind of it's not a very helpful label, but it includes things like a set aside for a potential snow and ice deficit to be raised, and then about $10,000 in state and county assessments. And then the last segment of this is our capital appropriations. So those are all the things that show up as warrant articles in the budget. So again, that's our total expenditures, operating and capital, at just north of $24 million. This slide gives you a bit of a picture of the way our operating budget is spent, and you'll see that education's about 65% of our operating budget. The next highest component is actually public safety, so that includes both police and fire. Then you've got debt service at about 5.85% of our operating budget. DPW, which is 5.82%, then general government, employee benefits, culture and recreation, which includes library. I know culture and recreation you might not think, but that's where our library budget is reflected. And then human services, which includes Board of Health, Council on Aging, veterans benefits, and finally other insurance, which is sort of small change liability policies for police and fire, accident, professional liability, things like that. This slide just gives you a sense of the way the big drivers of our operating budget have changed year over year. So one thing that I just think it's important for the public to understand, although our year over year increase is actually quite modest, it's a 1.92% increase. The reason why we have such a modest increase this year is largely because our debt service costs have gone down over 30%. Some of that is sort of real cuts in our debt, but part of it, actually, I think almost $400,000 worth, is because our Florence Sawyer debt obligation is coming off of our books. So I wouldn't want the public to start to anticipate, a 31 decrease in our debt service from year to year, because it's just not going to happen. So all the other big components of our budget have actually increased a bit. Education, which the superintendent will be speaking about later, is up 5.32%. Again, that's both Nashoba and Minuteman, so she'll be talking about Nashoba. Public safety budget is up, and that's in large part because we have budgeted for a full-time fire chief, which we've never done before. Public works is up modestly, and that includes some budgeting for summer work that we didn't do last year, but it has to be done. And then other government, which includes basically everything else that you would think of when it comes to the town, is relatively flat at 2%, which is virtually our cost of living increase. So that's great. And then benefits and insurance, as I said before, that's largely up because of health insurance premiums. This is just a quick overview of the major capital items that are showing up as articles in this year's warrant. I won't spend too much time on this unless people have questions. The one thing I just wanted to point out is that with the exception of article number 25, which is to replace the culvert at Long Hill and West Pond, all of these capital items are being paid for with free cash or other available funds, which means the only thing that we're borrowing any money for is just a portion of Article number 25. We're pleased about that because the less we have to borrow, the less we pay in interest. And so where we can, we do try to use free cash to pay for these capital items. Just quickly go through some factors for this year. As I already mentioned, operating budget is up, but total budgeted expenditures are down just a little bit. This was a tough budget year because based on everybody's initial requests, we had a $360,000 deficit. We were able to reduce or defer spending to get to a balanced budget, but this was really tough work. I mean, literally our town administrator sent out a letter to all the department heads and said, please go back and look at the budgets we've already gone over and identify areas for savings. And I think it's to the department head's credit that they were able to come back with some great suggestions on how we could get this into balance. We've already talked about the education component increase. The non-education portion of the operating budget is decreasing 3.82%, but again, that's largely because of our debt service payment going down. So although it's good and we're pleased about it and we're able to balance our budget, I don't want the public to think that, you know, our operating budget is just going to go down from year to year, because this was kind of a special year because of that debt coming off. We've already talked a bit about the public safety budget increase, which includes the potential hiring of a fire chief. The employee and retiree benefit costs are increasing. The things that the town's doing to try to contain those costs are twofold. One, they're going to be introducing a health savings account paired with a qualified high deductible as an option. So the premiums for those plans are lower. It's an optional thing. I think it's being rolled out next year. So that's one potential avenue. And then the other is that we had our HR director, Donna Madden, discussing a health insurance buyout program where the town would pay some of the employees to potentially forego the town's insurance if they could get their health insurance through a spouse. So those are a couple ways that potentially we can reduce our healthcare costs. As I already mentioned, nearly all of our capital items are being funded with free cash, and we are going to partially borrow for the culvert, but not even the full amount. So we're not borrowing $250,000. We'll be borrowing something less than that, closer to like $150,000. And then the only use of free cash in our operating budget is to make sure that we're fully funding our other post-employment benefits contribution, our OPEB annual required contribution. This slide is actually, I'll give you a little background. So over the past 2 years, the advisory committee and the board of selectmen have been trying to identify and implement best practices that were promulgated by the Division of Local Services and the Government Finance Officers Association. So they put out these best practices, but there's also discretion to shape your specific target based on your community's profile. So, you know, a target for Boston wouldn't be an appropriate target for Bolton. So what we've done over the past year is we set targets. We're kind of test running them, but they're meant to keep our eye on the ball, make sure that we're paying attention to the town's overall financial health. So the first two targets here are related to the certified free cash that we have each year. The first target is actually a sort of backward-looking target. What we want is when we get free cash certified in like the fall, so for example, when our free cash was certified this past fall, we took that number and we looked at how it compared to our total budget for the budget year that was just passed, fiscal year 18. And the target is that we want our certified free cash to be in the range of 3 to 5% of the total budgeted expenditures from the prior fiscal year. So this year we were at 3.18%, so we're at the low end of our target. The forward-looking free cash target is that at the end of our budget process, we want to have at least $350,000 of free cash sort of left over heading into the next fiscal year. And the budget that's reflected in the warrant that everybody has, we'll have 353,000 roughly of free cash left over. So we're hitting that target, but to be honest, we're just barely hitting it because we did have to use some free cash for our capital items and for our OPEB expense. The next target is more of a reserves target, and there's some debate about there's ongoing debate about what we actually want to count as our reserves. Other towns have done what we've done this year, which is to include our free cash, our stabilization funds, and our overlay reserve, add all those amounts together, and then see what percent of total expenditures we have. So with that metric, we're 8.51% in reserves compared to our total expenditures, which is healthy because our target is 8 to 10%. As I mentioned before, we have a debt service target. In this case, we've chosen a target of 5 to 7% of general fund revenues. We don't want our debt service payments to be any more than that. And our result for fiscal year 19, the upcoming budget, is 5.89%, which is, we're pleased with that. And then the last thing is that we've made a commitment to fully fund our annual required contribution toward OPEB. And we did that this year, so we're at 100%. I don't want to get too bogged down in free cash. This is just to illustrate that from fiscal year 2018 to fiscal year 2019, when we started our budget cycle in January, we just had less free cash for fiscal year 2019 than we had heading into 2018. And that's largely a product of the fact that the departments really do try to budget very conservatively. So at the end of a prior fiscal year, to the extent there are any quote-unquote turnbacks, they're not a whole lot. So we don't have a lot of extra cash that's rolling over from year to year. We're still within our target, but it'll be interesting to see in the fall where we come out with our certified free cash, because we started off with less this year. We're leaving a little less in the kitty at the end of this cycle. We're hoping that it works out because we're still within our target, but it'll be a learning year for us. This is just another slide related to reserves, which just breaks down the numbers. I won't spend too much time on this unless people have questions. We can go back to it. Okay, so you saw earlier that we rely very heavily on taxes, residential and business taxes, as our sources of revenue. So in this year's warrant, we actually have a couple of articles that represent new revenue possibilities. The first one is Article 14, which piggybacks on the Planning Board's Article 13 related to zoning for recreational marijuana establishments. So basically, on the assumption that Article 13 passes, Article 14 we also hope will pass, so that to the extent that there are retail sales of marijuana that occur in Bolton, we would get a local sales tax of 3% on those. Article 15 is the acceptance of the local meals tax, and this would allow the town to impose basically a 75-cent per $100 spent tax. It's important for everybody to understand that this is a tax not on restaurant businesses. It's a pass-through tax to the end purchaser of the meal. And so that shows up, it actually will show up and be printed on the customer's receipt. And based on the Department of Revenue estimates, they say that our annual revenue from implementing the local meals tax would be somewhere around $60,000. It could be a bit more than that. And that would, just to go, if you remember when we were looking at the pie of revenue, that meals tax would become part of the local receipts slice of the pie. This slide shows the impact on the estimated tax rate for fiscal year 19. The assessors would want me to really underscore that this is estimated. This won't be finalized until December of 2018, but this is just a projection based on the numbers that they have now. The tax rate per thousand will be going up 36 cents, which is like a 1.7% increase. And the average single-family tax bill would be going up about $184. Not to beat a dead horse, but we rely heavily on residential taxes. On advisory, you know, this is something we're keeping our eyes on because it is difficult to sustain over the long term. You know, we're focused on making sure that town expenses aren't growing at an unsustainable rate, but you also have to keep in mind service levels and quality. And so, you know, we need to look, what are the potential revenue sources apart from our traditional reliance on residential? We also need a long-term strategy to address the education component of our budget and to prepare for capital projects for the school. I'm sure the superintendent will talk a little bit about, you know, we have a statement of interest, which the scope is anything up to a potential new building. And the fact is, people move to Bolton because we have a great school system. We need a strategy to sustain the education budget and make sure that the things that we want to be able to afford, we can afford. And we also need to address various challenges along the Main Street corridor. In fact, we're going to be applying for a grant to pay for engineering to identify some of the problems and potential solutions along that 117 corridor. This next slide is just a visual illustration of the different components of our operating budget by type. It's a little bit difficult to see, and we will be posting this to the advisory committee page on the town website. But what we want to just call out is that this rate of increase is not matched by really a corresponding source of revenue. And so we need to start thinking creatively about what we're going to do to make sure that we can afford the important town services that we rely on. Obviously, education, as in every community, is a huge component, but we've also experienced growth on the town side as well, which is to be expected. I mean, you can't just manage on a fixed budget from year to year. As the population has increased from 2003 to 2017, you have to pay more for town services. And then just to close things out, we wanted to mention that we support updating the master plan, and after this budget year is closed out, you know, and we start looking to next year, we welcome everybody's input. So that's what we got. If anybody has questions.
Anything missed? We sort of concluded, or?
Anyone have any questions for advisory?
Do you think this is clear?
Quick question. On that, one of those first pie chart slides that you showed the residential, I think it was the residential tax base, and you were showing the contrast between the amount that we pay, that's it, and then where other revenue sources are coming from. Is it possible to show in what part of that blue is business tax only versus residential?
We probably, I know that the Department of Revenue is able to break down taxes based on like the zone, so we could probably figure that out, but I'm not sure we could do it for 2019.
No, that's fine. And I was thinking, certainly, didn't want to get more work for you, but as things are starting to progress towards, you know, do we let more businesses in? How much is that helping our tax rate? There's been a lot of discussion about that lately. So I thought for future town meetings, folks may be interested to see how much of our business base is contributing to our revenue.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you.
Could I ask one more question?
Sure.
In regards to the debt service coming off of Florence Sawyer School, that 527,000-ish number, is that inclusive of what the state is also supplementing in regards to the debt payment? Or, in other words, so would the delta then be a lot less than that in terms of what we're actually seeing back to the the town in terms of a lack of debt service, if you will?
Yeah, so where that would show up is in, I've gone back to sources of revenue. If you looked at our state aid last year, our state aid was closer to 600,000 because we had about 400,000 from the MSBA that was coming in, and it showed up as like revenue. The total debt service was, as you said, closer to 527. So there's a gap of roughly 100 grand.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's what we'll see as beneficially moving forward, that lack of payment of that extra 100,000.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
I was thinking too, I'd be interested to see the breakout of local receipts.
You mean in terms of the motor vehicle and the fee? Yep, we could do that.
And again, whenever, next time.
Sure.
Just be curious, because I would think that the majority of it would be motor vehicle.
I would expect so.
In fact, I can just tell you if you're curious. So, yeah, motor vehicle, so the total there of local receipts is like 1.3 million, and motor vehicle is 875,000. So, like well over half.
Any other questions on the budget? Well, then let's talk about the school.
Happy to do that.
School budget. Superintendent.
Thank you. And Pat Maroney will be joining me. She is our Director of Business and Finance.
You want to sit here so you can face out? Because we can move over.
I can do the slides for you.
That would be great if you don't mind. Sure, we'll sit over there. Sure. Thank you for clicking. That's great. So I'm going to just kind of tee things up, and then Pat will go through some of the details. We're just wrapping up another really solid year within the school district. And I just wanted to kind of spring from a couple of things that Ryan had said earlier. He's absolutely right. The statement of interest has gone in. It has been received by Mass School Building Authority. If we are invited to be queued up, only then would a much lengthier process go into play. So, I mean, it's not as simple as we get queued up and then we're off to the races. It doesn't work like that. And there are lots of opportunities if the community along the way, either Bolton or Stowe or Lancaster, decides that this is not the route that they want to take. So there will be a lot of opportunity thereafter. At the end of the day, though, I would agree 100% with what Brian was saying. We need to strategize. We have an aging building. We have to decide if we're going to continue to put money into it or if we're going to ask for some help. And right now we're asking for help. And you're absolutely right, either major modernization and or up to a new building. But we didn't submit for a brand new building, so we want that made very, very clear. This was also a year for us. We had a major forensic audit done. I'm sure most of you know that a year ago. And we developed a number of corrective action plans. And so we've had two corrective action plans that we've been working on out of your offices. We had another corrective action plan working out of the SPED office. And so those are just kind of nicely wrapping up now, successfully wrapping up. So to your point, you had alluded earlier to the notion of making sure that this is a healthy fiscal environment. And I know that you were talking about the community of Bolton. We feel that strongly as well within our environment of the school district. We work very, very hard to be very thoughtful about our process. We have a very active, and we did last year and this year. Last year it was called a FinCom, Finance Committee. This year it was called a Budget and Warrant Committee. They're very, very active, and they meet regularly, and they ask a lot of probing questions. We do a lot of work to make sure that there's a clear understanding and that there's a really solid level of transparency in all of our work. It was nice because both Neil Darcy and Mark Jones sat on that committee for 2 years, and so that was really stabilizing, I think, for us, because they were kind of there through the whole forensic audit and the MASBO audit and all that kind of thing, and they kind of helped us, make sure that there was a nice stability going into this year. So we feel very, very comfortable and very satisfied with our efforts to date. We did take a look, I know this probably isn't a large thing, but even how we presented our budget books, we went back, we took a serious look at the budget book, the pamphlet that we sent out that I think has gone to every household now across the 3 communities. We tried to be very thoughtful about what was in here and making sure that there was good information for people. If anyone has any questions along the way, of course, we're always open. Just email us, give us a call. We're happy to respond in whatever way that we can. We're going to go through a bit of a snapshot of where we're at. I think the other thing too, Brian, I appreciated the fact that you continue to say it's both Minuteman and Nashoba, because that's an important piece, when you take a look at the increase in Nashoba and the increase in Minuteman, and for very different reasons. I would also want to do a shout out to Don Lowe, who sat on our negotiating team this year. Very, very helpful. We had quite a lengthy process for our Unit A, which is all of our teaching staff. And now I would say, just about wrapped up. I think we're looking for ratification of the Unit C. We're just at the tail end of our Unit C contract. And Don has sat in on all of those. And those are pretty extensive meetings, and he's been very, very helpful for us. So great asset. The other thing I would say, do a shout out to all of our town administrators, but our town administrators meet with me. We try to do every month or every other month, depending on where we're sitting in the school year, which has been very, very helpful for us. All the way along. So in December, for example, when I went forward to the town administrators in one of our meetings, I said, this is where I think we're landing right now, and very similar to the process that you took. We kind of put everything all in there and said, there's no way we can possibly fund this. We just couldn't. And so we did our budget workshop with the school committee on January 20th, and then we started to peel it back, and we came up with continuous reiterations until we got to where we thought we could land. And so I don't know how many full iterations we did, more than we presented, certainly. Like you, we work with all of our units, all of our different departments, and I give a lot of our leadership of those departments a lot of credit, because I think that they've pared down as well. So having said all of that, Pat, if you can walk us through, and then I can tie things up.
So our proposed budget for fiscal year 19 represents a $114,104. It's a 3.91% increase over fiscal year 18 voted. And as you can see from this pie chart, a large percentage of our budget represents salaries, and a pretty good sized chunk represents benefits, and then the balance is non-salary.
So it's a very small portion of the entire budget is discretionary.
So for the overall, for the 3 towns, the voted budget of $54,114,000 is the 3.91% increase. And there's also a high school debt component, which is decreasing over the years. It's down to $455,000. We have local revenue, which is the revenue from the state and locally generated revenue, and this would be E&D, Chapter 70, and our Medicaid. And then this would be, the next line is the total assessed to the towns, and that would be for all 3 towns at $44 million. The variable assessment, which is $20,218,000, is the remainder, and it's based on a 5-year rolling average per the regional agreement that the towns have with the district. For the town of Bolton, this represents a 31.8% 5-year rolling assessment, fixed assessment of $8,073,490. This fixed assessment is the portion of the $24 million which is the minimum local contribution determined by the state. The variable portion is based on the $20,218,000, which would be the 31.8% of that. Again, the fiscal year net debt assessment for the high school is based on the enrollment at the high school. So basically, we look at the student enrollment at the high school and we base that assessment to the town of Bolton based on the number of students there. So the total assessment for fiscal year 19 is $14,673,318. Last year's assessment was $681,374 less, which this increase represents 4.87%. If you could just go back, I just want to say one other thing. And also, from this budget, I just want to mention that the E&D that we used for this year was $800,000 for fiscal year 19, as opposed to $1 million from the previous year.
And we want to mention too that that's one of the things that we're trying very strategically to get off the hamster wheel with, because previously that E&D was used in and out of the budget, and it was strongly cautioned to us by the forensic auditor that that was not the process that we should be using. So we're trying very hard to get off. In fact, the first number that we put in our first iteration was at 600.
Right. So impacts, as you could see from that pie chart, district-wide salaries have always been the biggest impact in the budget. It's a 6.19% increase from fiscal year 18. Part of this is because we had a new contract and a 3-year contract with our Unit A and our Unit C. And overall, I think 6.19% is pretty good considering all the work that was done in reevaluating the contracts and bringing forth something that we could live with for the next couple of years. Employee and insurance benefits, it's 4.97% increase. Again, we looked at our insurance this year and made some changes to try to save some money for the district, and this is basically as far down as we could go.
And I think it's important too to mention that the employee insurance plan is part and parcel of the contract. So I think sometimes people think, oh, you can just go out and do this or that, and it's not that easy because it is all tied in. But we did strike a committee this year that was also by contract, and that committee met several times and then came forward with some suggestions. But we are all in agreement that we are going to be going out and taking another look at it, likely in the summer going into the fall. So we're hoping to bring that particular component down even a little bit more if we can next year.
Now for special education, we had a 0.25% increase, which is very good considering we're at the mercy of, especially for out-of-district placements, we're at the mercy of some of the, and compliance for all of that. We looked at our grants and did some shifting of funds to see if we could save some money. There are some components of grant funding as related to salaries that we were able to save $50,000, and we shifted the spending from salaries to transportation, special ed transportation, and that's why there's a significant drop in the transportation.
And our auditors were involved in this to help us as well.
And that seems to be kind of the trend across the state, because there's like an assessment to the retirement boards that you really don't get anything. It's in addition to what we normally pay, so it doesn't make sense to continue to do that. So grants and revolving funds, as you can see that they have gone down $742,000, and I think you'll see that the spending in that regards is because we had some surpluses in some of our revolving funds in last year's budget. We made a conscious effort to try to bring a lot of those balances down, and we're continuing to do that. We've taken a really deep look at all of the revolving accounts and gone into specifics as to how these funds are going to be spent as they should have been in the past.
The other thing I think we should mention too is we continue to, in some areas, receive less grant money, particularly at the state level. And this year we had one or two times where we were anticipating from last year's budget going into this current fiscal year that we would receive grant X, and all of a sudden, maybe 2 weeks before we would have gotten it, we received word from the state that we would not be receiving it. And so it's not that something we could have counted on before or saw coming at all. It happened to us, I think, at least twice this year. So, I think that I think we just need to be really thoughtful about our grant money expenditures.
Next page, proposed changes. This year's budget, we have proposed an assistant superintendent, a special educator for the Hale Middle School. It's part of a new program for some of our special needs students. We're trying to bring kids back into the district. It's a lot less expensive to educate them in district than it is to send them to another district program. We have a program need for a .4 ELL teacher at Hale.
Just because of the sheer logistics of the ELL population that we're starting to see more and more across the district.
There's a need of an increase of .4 at the Mary Rowlandson Elementary School, a .4 interventionist, and that's an increase of an existing teacher up to 1.0. Also,
just keeping an eye on this next one.
Yeah, this next one is Mary Rowlandson Elementary. There's also an enrollment
potential issue in one of the grade groupings. We had that happen here in Bolton as well. You kind of keep your eye on it, and sometimes you're going to be okay, and other times you say no, we need to break this class up. It's just a little too large, So we have this actually happening in each one of our communities. Right now that we've got a couple of different classes that we're keeping an eye on. And
they're very different.
Yeah.
The issues are very different. And we also have an assistant middle school principal at the Luther Burbank.
Yeah. I just want to go back. The assistant superintendent, just FYI, I'm going to go through a couple of these just to add a couple points, and I'll do the initiatives too. The assistant superintendent, that position never went away, but you'll recall that you had an assistant superintendent previously, and when that person left, we did not backfill that position. We just kind of hung on to it for a little bit. And so this year we looked and said, you know what, we need to go back and now backfill it now. So it wasn't that it's a new ad that you've never had, it's just we didn't backfill it for 2 years. The special educator, the only reason I want to jump on that for half a minute is just because Joan DeAngelis, who is our Director of Pupil and Personnel Services, who oversees special education as part of her umbrella, has been really terrific about introducing some new programs in our district. And we introduced a couple last year, and they've proven to be very successful. So we're very excited about this one starting up at Hale as well. And to Pat's point, what it's doing is it's keeping our students in district rather than going out, and or bringing some of our students back in, because we would really prefer to be educating those children rather than sending them out. So we feel really, really good about some of the work that's being done in this area. And the others I think are pretty standard. The assistant middle school principal, just to speak for that in a minute, for a moment, that's just something we've watched over the last couple of years, and that's just a real need in that particular building. So we're really looking forward to being able to help support that building with that extra little bit of help there. The initiatives, I'll just speak to the initiatives and then you can take the offsets and efficiencies. The initiatives, this is year 4 of the 8th grade Chromebook initiative, the one-to-one. We have a new special education program, which we've alluded to before. Middle school digital learning focus, very excited about where this is moving to. Just putting the fine touches on it right now, but you'll see us, I think, do some very exciting work at that level this year, so we're really looking forward to that. The continuation, our early literacy initiative, this will be year 4 of a 5-year plan. So that's gone very, very well, and we've definitely seen an uptick in our MCAS that we're attributing to that program, so we feel that that's going very, very well. Math and science both have different implementation components to them that are ongoing. Math certainly with the new textbook series. Science is because we had new science standards come out from the state and we're just implementing them. And there's some new technology, science technology standards that have also come out that you'll see us tie in with that middle school digital learning focus. In the next year or so, we've got our eyes on social studies because we have new curriculum that's coming out in that area as well. You'll also see us this year take a quick peek at, there were some changes to the current math and ELA curriculum in terms of frameworks and standards. So you'll see us implement them, but it wasn't a large enough initiative to put up there. These are really our key initiatives that we're looking at next year.
So for offsets and efficiencies, and during that process of looking at the budget, you know, we had the wants first and then needs, and then we had to really look at where are our people, where are our key people, what are our initiatives, and how are we going to put the money where it's needed. So you'll see that there's been a district-wide staff realignment. Strategic planning, we have established an OPEB trust. We're in the 90-day waiting period as of today. So there will be, we have a trustee in place and we're just waiting for that to be taken care of.
Very excited about that.
Yes. There's a high school stabilization fund that's proposed in your warrant articles and the other 2 towns, and we're excited about that. We were worrying about what would we do, you know, in a couple of years if we needed some major you know, repairs to be done to that turf field, and it's very expensive to have that done. We wanted to have something in place where we could put aside some money every year and, you know, truly
be proactive with it.
Proactive rather than going back to the towns and asking them for more money. And again, we're looking back at the maximizing the grant dollars. The grant dollars, again, we're trying to get off of the using it for salaries because of, like I said, that retirement component, which is 9% of salaries paid out of the grant. And I just want to tell you, it's the federal grants, it's not the state grants that they have us do that. So there are some grants that require that you have staff, you know, paid from it. But if you don't need to, we're really looking at this and trying to realign our funds so that we get the most bang for our buck out of that.
I just want to go back up to staff realignment for half a minute. Both last year and this year, we really looked hard. Like when we take a look at the broad view, we do look at people's certification. We look to see if there's some other way that position could be better utilized in some form or another. But I wouldn't want you to think that, you know, we've got 500 people that we're realigning, because it's not that at all. But it is in some cases, you know, like for example, we made, I know that you're well aware that we made some changes to the integrated pre-K program. And so that's an example where we took a look and said, can we be assured that all of these people will end up over here somewhere and that they're not just displaced? And so that was an example where we sat down as a large group and took a look at everybody's certification to make sure that it all worked appropriately. So we'll go to the next slide. I can take this actually.
Okay.
So these are just the FY suggested areas of focus. We are in the process of preparing our district improvement plan for the FY19 year. It all ties back into this budget. You know, I think it's really important that people trust that we have taken a really hard look at the areas, and I think you said it well earlier, kind of shifting the money to make sure that it's done in a way that makes the most amount of sense for the efforts that we're putting forward. And next year, you'll see some of these areas, well, everything that's up here, the district-wide technology and digital learning, I've already alluded to the fact that you'll see that, and that will be on our district improvement plan as well. Continuing with the district-wide social emotional needs and programming, I think that we've still got some work to do in that area, and probably will always have work to do in that area, but you'll see us put a focus on that. Evaluation, I've alluded to that already, of district benefits and the cost structures. I've already mentioned about the SOI and the potential of a feasibility study thereafter. The stabilization fund for the turf track and field capital, Pat has alluded to that. Continued, which is the ongoing work of the efforts that we've already been working on. The oversight of the corrective action plans, which I had alluded to earlier. Evaluation of district cost centers. We've literally done that all year this year, but that work will continue to be ongoing. Our MCAS assessment, next generation compliance needs and support, I think that our staff did a really great job with that this year, and it shows when you take a look back at the MCAS scores, and we'll put that up here in a minute. Evaluation of early education programs, you see that we've already started that work, but that will continue. And the assessment of the district facilities, including capital plan, really goes back to exactly some of your comments earlier, Brian. So if we can take a look at the last page, and again, I can speak to this just ever so briefly. Pat prepared this, and she and her staff, and you can go into some detail if I'm missing it. But it kind of gives you a flavor of the Nashoba Regional School District cost per pupil backed against the state average, and what's happened over the course of the years. And kind of juxtaposed in some ways underneath that is the Nashoba Regional School District MCAS trends. And the first bar to the kind of the blue-purple is our ELA, the next is math, and the next is science. And you see the first one, and it's going back, you can take a look at the school district versus the state in each of those for FY 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17. And those are that's where our kids are ranking in the percentile. So I mean, for us to be, for example, like at the 97th percent, that's amazing. These scores are simply amazing. Our students do so incredibly well, and you have to give a shout out to the parents, the students, the staff, the administrative team, and everybody that works so hard. But those scores are certainly scores to take so much pride in. So that gives you a flavor of where the scores are, and kind of here's the money that we're spending, and here's what the scores are showing at the bottom. So that's a quick it wasn't that quick, it's maybe a little longer than you wanted, and I apologize. We'll have to make it shorter for town meeting, so I think we only have 10 minutes that night, so I promised Dawn we'll shorten this up as quickly as we can. But it gives a flavor, and I hope that we've hit on the key salient points that you'd be looking for. And like I said to Dawn earlier, we've all been so open about our budgets, and I know that you've probably seen all of this stuff a million times, whether it's your budget or our budget or what have you. But if we've missed something, please let us know. And if we don't have an answer tonight, we can certainly find one.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think tonight it's good that we get that detail.
Oh,
And
good.
for anyone who's going to watch this, at home, it'll be great for them to see that, because you obviously you won't have that much time at town meeting, and it's nice to get a little more depth. Are there any questions from the school committee?
I have a question. For your revenue numbers, I know that like the governor's budget is probably the one you're looking at when this gets voted on, but have you seen any of the more recent like House budget numbers, and are they looking better or?
A little bit better than House One numbers. But we're always very conscientious, as I'm sure that you are too, because you have to go through the House, the Senate, the conference, and then you kind of land in July and say, okay, now here's where you're at, And by then, your staffing is already in place, and you're ready to go. So I think that, I think Pat and her office tend to, you already budget conservatively anyway. And so when those numbers come in, we feel very comfortable at that point in time. So if there's a little uptick at all, as there is right now, you know, for example, a circuit breaker, we're expecting that there's going to be a little bit more in circuit breaker. But that doesn't affect us for this year because our circuit breaker is actually 1 year out. So the circuit breaker money, if we get more circuit breaker this year, won't affect us for the 19 year. It will actually affect us for the 20 year. So those are all the things you kind of need to keep in mind when you're looking at those numbers. If you see an uptick, it may not even really affect us this year. But right now, as it stands, there's a small uptick
Yeah.
that would potentially
Better
affect
than
us.
the opposite, right?
Oh, definitely. My goodness, yes. We're pleased with that. As long as we stay where we're at, we'd be comfortable. Yes.
My apologies, I don't have the budget book in my hand. Is there,
Happy to give you mine.
no, that's okay, that's okay. I need to get my hands on one anyway, because I'm gonna be writing all over it. Are they available locally
They
somewhere?
absolutely are, and thank you for asking that. Gives us a chance to kind of promote it and put it out there, so thank you for doing that. Yes, I think that we did a really good job this year to get it out even sooner than we did last year. And as soon as they're hot off the press, you literally drive them around to every town hall office. And so you've got some, and then we keep some back ourselves in case anybody wants to come and see it. And I believe it's online too.
It's online as well.
So if you wanted to go online, you could see it. But for somebody like me, I need something like this to write in, so
I'm
I'm
the
always
same
looking
way.
for this.
So can I ask you just a couple, they're very short, I think, very
Sure.
quick, short, I promise, short questions. On your key budget impacts, your employee insurance and benefits line, does that include your OPEB increase?
The I
that
don't think so.
separate?
I
No,
think
it
the
doesn't.
the
Okay.
OPEB is elsewhere.
Got
But
it.
thank you for bringing that up, because we're in our third year of, this will be our third year of putting money into OPEB.
Okay.
But I would say, unlike your local government here, we're nowhere near at that 100.
I wasn't even gonna ask, I know, but it's great that you're starting the process.
We're
and getting
pleased with
to
that.
us. And it's moving forward, so I'm not even
Yeah.
gonna ask what your arc is, I don't wanna know.
Okay.
But thank you for moving it forward. The only other question I had was, actually, two, again, very brief. The type of SPED program at Hale, do you have a name for it yet? Or it's addressing what type of needs?
There is a name for it. I can't recall what the name is right now. They are all linked. Like there's the early risers that goes to Rise. There's little links that goes to links, and I can't remember the name of that program. I believe the focus is autism.
Thank you. And then my last question, you mentioned new state science standards, did I hear that? Where are we at with our current high school in terms of NEASC accreditation with our current science centers, and if, knowing that even though the SOI is out there, that it's not, by the time you're going to get reaccredited, it's not going to have happened yet, are we looking at something there?
So that's a really good question, because to be honest with you, when I wrote the SOI, you can imagine that was a key point in there,
Good.
right?
Okay.
So I don't know if that's helpful at all. Do we recognize that we have some gaping holes there in terms of facilities and such? Yes, we absolutely do, and that is one of our thrusts.
And that made it into the SOI. Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For looking at the school budget for us. And thank you, Brian. That is the end of our meeting. Thank you.